Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What was your creepy or strange encounter as a child that was confirmed by your parents when you were older? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was looking for a Halloween costume with my mom to wear to elementary school, which was a big deal to me because I was homeschooled at first. We spent a couple of hours going to several stores and couldn't find anything that I liked. It was getting dark outside, so we were going to have to find something and go home soon. There was an old Halloween costume store, one of those really weird places that somehow is open year-round, that we decided to go to as a last-ditch effort to find something. We got out of the car and walked through the front doors and got 3 steps into the place, and I instantly had all the hair on my body stand on end. I felt huge, oppressive pressure on my whole body, like the physical being of being hated by something, combined with it wanting to hurt me and wanting me to leave. My little 3rd grade self, I think that's when it happened, turned to look at my mom, and in the same instant, she turned to look at me. We didn't say a thing to each other, just turned around after only walking 3 steps into the store and went back to the car. I remember getting inside and asking my mom if she felt the same thing, and she said that she had essentially the same experience as me. We prayed together in the car and left. For perspective, I, as an elementary school kid who desperately wanted to fit in with the other kids that I had recently joined in public school, willingly left our literal last chance to find a costume that I thought would help me fit in because of a physical feeling of being hated that I got when we walked into the store. As an adult, I can still remember how bad it was, and am getting tensed up just writing about it. I did end up with the costume that year, though. We went home, and she stayed up late with me working to cobble together a cowboy costume from things we had at home. I had a cowboy hat from my grandpa, some cowboy boots from somewhere, a button-down shirt that we ripped a bit to make it rugged, a bright red bandana to tie around my neck, and a swanky leather vest we made from brown grocery bags that we cut some super cool tassel fringe onto. When I was young, I apparently had a few odd interactions with animals. I would know a person had animals before we went into the house. They tended to come over to me before my parents, mostly just little things that were probably explainable by me being a fairly observant little kid. The one that sticks out to my parents, though, telling it the way they do, is we went to a new car garage to have them work on our car. As we pull up, the owner has a big old black lab lying in the middle of the lobby. The guy informs us the dog is comfortable with people. We can pet him if we want. I shake my head and say, "He's sad though." Dad looks at me and asks why I think that. I reply, "He lost his ball. He's sad now." Dad said the owner went pale, stared at me for a minute, and then looked at Dad and said, "He's had a favorite ball for 10 years that just went down the sewage drain yesterday, and I couldn't get it back." I'm not 100% sure this fits because my mom confirmed it years ago, then denied it when I asked her again a couple of months ago, but here it is. When I was little, my dresser, it was long but pretty short, sat against the wall with one end pointed to my door. That dresser is heavy, an old wooden one with all sorts of kid crap neatly arranged on top. Since it was in my bedroom, the floor was carpet. I always slept with the door closed. One night, with no explanation, the dresser tipped over, but instead of falling forward, it fell 180 degrees to the side, falling in front of my door, all the kid crap spilling to the side. My mom ran to get me but couldn't open the door as it was being blocked by the dresser. Eventually, with her pushing and me pulling on the dresser, she was able to slip in and move the dresser out of the way. Nothing was damaged, not even the glass figurines I had. My dad helped put it upright the next day and we moved on. Years later, I remembered the incident and asked my mom about it, expecting to learn that I blew it out of proportion and it only fell forward or something like that. Nope, she remembered that night as well. However, she added one detail that I could never figure out. She thought she heard me jumping on the bed that night, and that was why she thought the dresser tipped over. I had been asleep. I have no idea where she heard that noise coming from. When I was a kid, my family lived in a blue house that was oddly shaped. One year the house got completely gutted and nearly destroyed by a flood, and they had to knock down a wall between the living room and the kitchen. So after the flood, you could see all the way down the hall to my parents' bedroom door. This house is and was strange, for lack of a better term. I was a terrible sleeper as a kid, and would routinely wake up and just go into the living room and watch cartoons on low volume if I couldn't go back to sleep. One morning, I'm out in the living room sitting across the chair with my feet up on a window. Don't ask me why. I was a stupid 8 or 9-year-old. From where the chair was, I could see just over the kitchen counter down the hall to my parents' room. A movement caught my eye. I looked up and saw the shadowy outline of a man walking toward me, kind of near to my parents' door. Thinking it was my dad, I said something like, "Hey Dad, sorry if the TV was too loud." Dad is a notoriously light sleeper and would wake up from anything. Except there was no response. Within seconds, my foot ends up going through the window again. Again, not sure if this is related or I was a dumb kid. Likely the latter. And I scream and my parents actually wake up to figure out what's going on at 4:30 in the morning. At this point, I'm preoccupied, but realize much later that I definitely saw the outline of a man. But there was no way it was my dad because A, he came bounding out of their bedroom after my scream, and B, I realized the shoulders of the outline were much higher than what my dad's would have been. Fast forward to a few years ago. We've moved far away from the blue house, and my mom and I are hanging out and catching up. For some reason, the blue house comes up, and I tell Mom that the place still gives me the creeps, and weird stuff happened there when I was a kid. Mom's response, "Oh, you must have seen the Shadow Man too." My grandmother was a real estate agent in Rhode Island. I was staying with her one summer, and she had to take me along to go see a potential listing. It was a very strange house because it was circular. All the rooms went along the outside and connected to each other, and there was a center part with a little garden room and open to the sky. She went up to the second story, and I stayed downstairs because I wanted to walk around the loop one time. The problem started when I had walked a full loop and I didn't see the stairs. I thought I must be confused, so I kept going to the next room and still couldn't find them. I started to panic, so I began running around the house as fast as possible, checking every room for stairs, and there weren't any. Finally, I sat down by the front door and started crying. A little while later, my grandmother ran into the entryway room, looking just as panicked as I had been, and asking where I was hiding and why I was hiding and not answering her calling out to me. I never heard her calling out to me. Actually, the house seemed so still and quiet while I was sitting there that I was sure she had forgotten and left me there. We went home and didn't talk about it really. Like 15 years later, I brought it up to my mom and asked if she knew anything, or was this a crazy childhood nightmare I'm remembering. She told me she remembered it clearly because my grandmother had called her and was absolutely spooked because she couldn't explain what had happened, and the thought that she had lost me or I'd been taken by someone while she was distracted. She had apparently been looking for me for a while. I still don't understand what happened, really, because the house wasn't even large or confusing to navigate. I still get chills when I think about it. A creepy circle house with a garden in the middle and an upstairs, and I don't know, it sounds almost like a short story horror. Wonder how we could expand on that universe. But interesting nonetheless. I wonder where that house is in Rhode Island. Thank you. I was very young when this happened, so what I remember and what I was told is the main story for this scariness. So my family was driving around the backwoods in New Hampshire and Maine area in the autumn to watch the leaves fall. We were staying at some cottage, and my family came to this area pretty frequently. We were coming back from somewhere when my mother started screaming at my father for stopping abruptly. In front of us, on unkempt back roads in the deep woods of New England at a pretty late hour, was a traffic jam of quite a few cars stopped in all directions. I remember a lot of bright headlights. I also remember seeing my dad's face as he turned around so he could see where he was reversing the car. My mom went completely silent through the whole thing. I just remember my dad saying eerily calmly, "Ugh, I hate traffic." He turned around and started driving back up the road we came down, and we started seeing cars going past us, flashing their headlights. My dad just kept driving. The whole atmosphere went from, "Wasn't that a fun day?" to "Let's leave." Even as a kid, I went from annoying to quiet. Just a thickness in the air. Cars started coming up from behind, honking and flashing lights, and eventually they had just turned off the road and we drove back to the cottage. Years later, decades later, my dad and I were having a beer together. He says, "Remember up in the woods up north? We were driving around and we came to a weird traffic jam." I was like, "Yeah, why?" I honestly hadn't thought of it since that night. My dad goes, "Well, your mother and I were pretty sure that was one of those ambushes where they block the road and try to rob you and leave you in the woods or worse. You don't remember the cars coming up the road after us trying to block us in? Or the cars chasing us and beeping at us until we hit a random route? Well, kind of, but I just figured it was traffic or people being weird." He just kind of stopped talking about it after that and went on about how we should plant more trees in the backyard, but ones that don't drop leaves because leaves suck. I woke up one night when I was 12 because I dreamt that my older brother got into a car accident. I got out of bed and wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get something to drink. My mother was sitting there and asking me why I was awake. I told her I had a bad dream and need something to drink. I got a glass of water when it rang at the door. My mother went to look who's there in the middle of the night. 2 police officers asked if they could come inside for a moment. I couldn't hear what they were talking about because I was still in the kitchen and they were in the hallway. After the 2 officers left, my mother came back to the kitchen completely pale and told me that I should go to bed now. I asked her what's wrong when she informed me that my brother was in a car accident and she needs to wake up my dad and go to the hospital now. When I pointed out that this was the bad dream I had before waking up, she only looked at me for a couple of seconds. I prepared myself for comments like, "Don't be silly and go to bed now," but instead she said, "Me too." So basically, we both had the same effing dream of my brother having a car accident, and we both woke up minutes before the police came over to tell us it really happened. My brother survived with some minor injuries, and we've seen the photos of accidents in the newspaper the next day. It looked 100% like in my dream, to the smallest detail. The way he lost control over the car, where it flipped the first time, and the tree it came to a stop. Even today, my mother and I talk about this. Nobody else believes us when we tell the story. When I was 9 or 10, my dad took me to visit with an older hunting buddy friend of his. My parents were divorced and my dad lived in another part of the country, so while I had known this guy since I was a toddler, I didn't share the same common interests as either of them. The older friend was a gun dealer and had lots of catalogs. This was before the internet was in wide use to order bullets, magazines, guns, etc. And they often spent hours going through listings to determine what they wanted to order. We got there fairly early, and my dad said that after an hour or two, we'd all go to Hardee's for breakfast before going to shoot clay birds. Now, I'm a youngin'. I don't care much about guns or hunting for sport, and am just incredibly bored. So I start wandering around the house, reading my video game magazines that I brought with me, and very quickly, that hour or two has passed, and they're still down there. I ask if they're going to leave anytime soon, and the friends suggest I check the refrigerator in the kitchen to see if there's anything I want to eat. I look through the fridge and find nothing. However, on the kitchen table, I see an apple and decide that will be appetizing enough to hold me over. As I pick up the apple and prepare to take a bite, at that point his wife steps in and tells me, "Don't eat that. Everything in the bowl is wax." I tell her thank you for the warning me, and continue to wander around the house, burning time until we can get going. Maybe another 30 minutes later, I go back to the basement where they're going through catalogs and ask when we're going to Hardee's. My dad's friend asks if I'm still hungry after going through their fridge. I tell him that I was going to eat an apple, but his wife told me it was wax before I made the mistake. Both of them gave me a blank stare, and after about 20 seconds of shock, my dad explains that his wife recently passed away. I then go back through the house to try and find her, to show that they were just joking with me. But sure enough, she was nowhere to be found. Roughly 30 years later, before he passed away, my dad still insisted that I must have imagined it, but I didn't. She told me not to eat the waxed fruit. At my parents' house, I used to hear my mom calling out to me when she didn't, and she confirmed she'd hear me call out to her when I didn't. That was a common occurrence. Also, whenever I'd be alone for a little while and my mom was late from work or at the grocery store, I'd usually be in the main living room playing Nintendo 64. I would oftentimes hear loud banging sounds from upstairs, as if a heavy piece of furniture tipped over. I'd go check and nothing was out of place. Both my mother and grandmother have confirmed similar experiences when they were alone in the house. There was also the time I was downstairs on my laptop, everyone else was in bed, it was after midnight, and I didn't realize just how dark everything had gotten without the lights on. I'm zoned out when I begin to hear what sounds like a murmuring from behind me, like the low rumble you'd hear at a gathering when people are talking about and you can't make out conversation. The hairs on my neck immediately stood up, and my body locked up from fear. Tears ran down my face from the physical reaction my body was giving. I refused to acknowledge it and kept staring at my laptop screen in silence. It took forever for my body to go back to normal. Sometime later I told my mother what happened, and it freaked her out because she said she'd heard the murmuring as well. I've always hated that house. When I was a kid, my mom used to work at a small grocery store, and she went there before breakfast to get freshly baked goods when she had this afternoon shift. Then she used to wake me up for school and ask how I'd slept, and I used to tell her what dream I had the night, if any. One morning I told her I dreamt that two guys broke into the store and they left a red screwdriver on the floor. My mom was shocked, because there really was a break-in that night. That is why she couldn't buy stuff for breakfast that morning, but she couldn't talk with police or colleagues at the time to get more details. I then went to school. My mom did the afternoon shift, and in the evening, when she came home, she told me that the police really did find a screwdriver on the scene, which belonged to the burglars. This all happened in Europe, in a small town around the early 90s, with no CCTV, and the burglars never got caught. But this was still a very strange experience. My mom made me fill out a lottery ticket the next day, lol, but I never won with it, and never had such dreams since then. This is sort of embarrassing. My mom got an IUD after my sister and I were born. 4 years after my sister, a random priest stopped her in the streets and told her, "Why are you stopping Goddess Durga's will? She wants to gift you a son." My mom was understandably freaked out. It's not like my family didn't want a son, because trust me, Asian obsession with sons is real. It's just that they didn't want another daughter, so they weren't trying. Anyway, a few days later, we had a curtain, sort of like a musical prayer meeting, and one of the ladies there got possessed by a goddess, Mata Anna, as Indians call it, sort of like a trance possession, and the person possessed started spewing all sorts of things that made sense but don't. Super creepy, scary shit. So that woman, a stranger, straight up looked at Mom and handed her an apple, said, "Eat it and get that foreign thing out. I want to give you a son. How dare you deny me my wish?" Word spread like fire about this incident. Suddenly, half the town was interested in my parents' marital life. Small town. Mom didn't budge then though. My parents met another priest who they considered their teacher. He said that they should try and let what meant to happen happen. Well, I had a brother within a year. Most exciting 9 months for our town, since we didn't know the gender. Gender testing is illegal in India to prevent female feticide. Alright man, here we go. This one really freaked me out, and it's just crazy. So I grew up in Burton upon Trent. Now as a kid, I always had a fascination with medieval era things, whether that be castles or knights. Now, when I went to one castle, Tutbury Castle, I was having a good time up until we got to the gate when I felt a hand grip my shoulder with a harsh grip and then I screamed. My parents asked me what's wrong, but I noticed a weird expression on their face, so I thought they felt it too. We left very shortly after, and I never went again. Soon after, I felt like I was always being watched. I would look into the garden and see a figure twitching, and I would always break down in my room. It got so bad that we had to move rooms. After a year of this thing chasing me, we moved to Basingstoke. After that, I never felt chased or watched. My life as an adolescent was normal. About a decade ago, I came back to my parents from the US, and I told them what I remembered. They said that everything I saw, they saw, and just wouldn't tell me, as they thought it would freak me out. We shared a good laugh about it, but it still makes my blood chill every time I think about it. When I was a baby, my mom rented a house from a friend who claimed it was haunted. She didn't believe it until she heard 1 to 2-year-old me sitting in my bed talking to 2 men that I'd said lived in the ceiling. She said she always thought my older sister would leave the TV on, thinking that's where the voices came from, until she heard me speaking back in my baby toddler talk to them. She said, the last month we lived there, I was a little over 2. She was in the bathroom directly across from my bedroom when she heard a man talking in my room. It was late. I was supposed to be asleep, and my mom says she just froze and listened. She said she couldn't understand what he was saying. Then the older man started talking, and she was freaked out and praying I was asleep, and the men were just breaking in and would come out and leave me alone. Then she heard me talking, and she rushed in the room. She said she practically broke the doorknob and saw nothing but me in my toddler bed. She said I looked at her with my bitchiest face and was mad. She said she had asked me who I was talking to, and I told her I was talking to the angels. Apparently I was pissed and pointed to the ceiling and just got so angry about her coming in. You made them go away. I don't remember any of it, to be honest, just what she told me. She believes in all those TV psychics and ghosts. I try to hold back and not be the dick and show her how psychics are fake and ghosts are probably not real. I live in Colombia, and my father's a doctor, and while growing up, his main work was as hospital director of the most isolated hospitals in rural areas. The good thing is that you'll get used to weird sounds at night, and the silent night watchers, mostly old folks, walking around without even a flashlight. Usually most of the hospitals we lived in were new and nice, until we got to an old town in the south of the country that was just partially renewed, and most of the construction was the old public retirement home or sanatorium, if you could call it a home, with a big part basically destroyed, falling ceilings, broken walls, you get the picture. One of my hobbies was to spend the entire evening playing dominoes with the head nurse and the night watchman and joining them on their night walks. One night, I was with Pasquale, walking around one of the old areas when I felt the urge to look back, and then it was a white-gray, shadowy figure in front of a boarded room that honestly always gave me the creeps. I remember holding his hand really hard, and that when he told me, just don't look, she loves to scare people, and if you look for too long it could get inside you. At that point, I honestly was more terrified of how calm he was than the specter itself. The good thing is that I ended up building the courage to walk through a bush area behind the constructions where the ambulances used to park. just to avoid crossing near the damned room. I can give you one that happened to my children. My identical twins' sons once had the same dream at the same time. I had to make a 6-hour round-trip drive. I didn't have a sitter, so the kids came along with. They slept for most of the drive. About halfway back home, I stopped at a rest area and decided I should wake them up to go to the bathroom. I turned around to wake them, and before I said anything, they both perked up a bit and opened their eyes. They started talking in perfect unison. "Dad, we should tell you about the dream we just had. We were driving down the highway and we saw 3 piles of bones. One was me, one was my Bubba, and one was my full name." I tried telling and talking to them, but it was like they couldn't hear or see me. They were 3 years old at the time. Bubba is how they said brother, and I was Dada to them. I'm not even sure how they knew my first and last name. I'm convinced they were both sleeping when they said that. Even now, 6 years later, if one of them has a nightmare, I'll go into their room to comfort them. They will sit up and kind of wobble back and forth with their eyes glazed over and tell me about the dream. But when I talk to them, they can't hear me. I was so shook up, there was no way I could have safely driven at that moment. We sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes or so. Then I finished the drive home. I still wonder if we were going to die that day. Some of our family friends own a crazy old house in upstate New York that was actually part of the Underground Railroad. The house has a ton of history and secret passageways all throughout it. It's also haunted. Every time someone new comes to the house, weird things happen. My cousin had heard people breathing in his room at night when he visits, and the lady that owns the house constantly has to turn the TV off because the ghost, who they call Morton, after one of the previous owners who had died in the house, turns it off. The youngest son tells a story where he was sitting in the kitchen and a large old china cabinet, which was up against the wall where a door out to the backyard used to be, smoothly and silently swung forward like a door opening. He said it was just like someone was walking outside. Also, the youngest daughter slept in a room that had a hidden trap door underneath the floor for escaped slaves to hide in. Multiple times, she has woken up to the rug covering the door flopped to the side like the door had been opened in the night. It's some crazy shit. But they all say that anytime Morton comes to visit, it doesn't feel malevolent or angry. They said it feels like Morton just living in his house still, and they have to share it with him. They've lived there for 20 some odd years and have no plans of moving, even in the middle of all this supernatural shit that's going on around them. I was raised solely by my mother. As a 6-year-old child, I frequently had a dream where I was a man. I was riding a motorcycle in full gear along with tall Cliff, or what looked like one to a younger me. I was going too fast and made a sudden turn. As I rounded the bend, a semi pulled out of seemingly nowhere, coming toward me in my lane. I made a sharp turn to try and save myself, but realized I'd go over the side of the cliff. I overcorrect and end up sliding under the semi while the driver attempts to gain control of his own vehicle. I feel my knee hit the pavement and hit my head on something underneath as I fall off the bike. The wheels approach. I stopped having that dream when I was 10 and stopped thinking about it. But I had told my mom about the dream at least 100 times by that point. When I was 17, my father was finally tracked down by the child support agency, and we found out he was the man in my dream. He was crippled from the waist down in an accident that went exactly like that. He spent a few years in a coma, which would have been from the time I was 6 till I was 10. He still wanted nothing to do with me. after and begged to not be held responsible for child support, and we let him off. I wanted nothing from him at that point. I was, however, amazed I so clearly had been able to describe the events that happened to him, even without having met him. Back as a kid, 7-ish-year-old me, my parents bought an old 1900-era villa that they moved an hour from its original place to the land and restored. Ornate pillars, arches in the central hallway, all the ornate and molded patterns in the roof around light fittings that around 3 meters high, 12-foot ceilings or something like that, hanging steel counterweights on ropes in the window frames for vertical sliding windows, and so on. When we viewed it before, it was cut in half and moved. The place was totally cleared out. Walls, floors, roofs, and not much else were left. There was an old dude, probably in his 80s, in a tall wingback chair in front of the windows in the front room, sitting like a statue with a newspaper, who ignored me when I tried to talk to him from the doorway behind him. Figured he was a grumpy old man that ignored kids. He wouldn't be the first guy like that I'd met. I asked my mom who he was and why he just was sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. She told me not to be silly and took me back to the now empty room, which totally baffled me. Fast forward, and after moving in, things got a tiny bit strange at night. We had an external diesel water heater for heating water and radiators in each room for heating. Butt pipes working all under the floors for circulating the water. Each night there was creaking every second for 15 to 20 minutes at a time, like wood on wood tapping going room to room. I was told it was the heat in the water heating the pipes as it circulated, but I know now that it took at most 5 minutes to get the entire system from cold to hot, not some slow and long process. The kicker to the creaks was the footsteps up and down the hallway slowly most nights, clear as day, going past doorways but with no one making them. Being kids, my sister, 5 and 6, and I, 7 and 8, shared a room, and at night before going to bed sometimes my dad would poke his head in the doorway to make sure we were asleep and tell us off if we were not. Game Boy was more important than sleep though. We had a desk lamp in the hallway outside of our room so we could get around without turning the light on to get to the bathroom at night, etc. But it also silhouetted my dad when he looked in. I remember the first time seeing the silhouetted man standing looking in the doorway. I'd never had, and have never since, just completely locked up in fear, unable to move or look away. The man was much shorter than my gigantic dad and taller than my rather short mom. As time went on, you'd wake up feeling watched, and he'd look in for a few minutes, usually looking from left to right at both our beds and sometimes waving as if to say go back to sleep, and then silently and stiffly walk on down the hallway toward the room I originally saw the man in the wing back in. For many years that room was empty except for lounge suite. My parents' room/lounge were further into the house. As time went on, it was a little less creepy, and sometimes you'd see him out of the corner of your eye, through the doorways, standing still in the hallway, just looking in at you. Creeps me out to this day that everyone knew he was chilling down going through the house. Never stopped until we moved out and moved the house off-site again 15-odd years later. After moving out, my sister brought up the man in the doorway when we were kids, confirmed by my parents too as the guy keeping an eye on his house. I've never believed in ghosts, etc., but man, there is no other way I could explain or rationalize the ongoing experiences of seeing and getting waves and so on from something that seemed to exist as much as it didn't exist.